Welcome to Pier-Glass Spotlights, where we will visit, as usual, one poem and its author. I'm Stan Galloway, your host, and today we're very pleased to look at The Beekeeper's Husband with Ama Codjoe. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Ama is the author of Blood of the Air from Northwestern University Press 2020, winner of the Drinking Gourd Chapbook Poetry Prize, and of Bluest Nude, forthcoming from Milkweed Editions in 2022. Among other honors, she has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council New York Foundation of the Arts, and the Jerome Foundation. She has been awarded support from such entities as Cave Canem, Callaloo Creative Writing Workshop, Crosstown Arts, Hedgebrook, and McDowell. Ama, would you begin by reading us your poem?
Absolutely. So the title of the poem is The Beekeeper's Husband. You used pine straw as fuel to smoke the bees deeper into the hive, compelling them to engorge their abdomens with honey. I could smell the sweat gathering under your bra. I wanted to lick the salty rivulets. How could I not be moved by the sight of your wrists exposed? After I chewed the golden wax like a plant surviving on light, after you lost 2 colonies to Varroa, one after the other, after you caught, all told, a dozen swarms of the neighbor's bees, I realized after it all that when you spoke so low it was hard to distinguish praying from cursing from singing. You weren't talking to yourself or to the bees, as I long believed, but to a God you no longer feared. When, on the day we met, I stooped to kiss your ungloved hand, you mistook me for a gallant, someone who hungers for sweetness. My dear wife, from the first it was salt I craved. This is the gesture that began our troubles, though you believe it was the night, years later, years ago, when I asked why, if you trusted me, you never undressed completely. With the bees you donned a veil, and with me, I insisted, you wore a second skin, the texture of bark. It scorched my hands to touch. When I told you this, we were lying in bed, recovering from giving whatever we could. You turned your naked back to me. Outside, a siren wailed and faded. That night, I slept soundly, sprawled on top of the sheets. I dreamt I was wingless and beautiful, treading water in a crystal blue sea. When I woke the next morning, ashen twigs and brittle leaves lay scattered on your pillow.
Thank you. One of the first things I notice about this poem is the title. The husband is the speaker of the poem rather than the subject of the poem. It might have been called The Beekeeper's Wife, with at least some accuracy. Why did you choose this title?
I was thinking about the Sylvia Plath poem, The Zookeeper's Wife. It's in her posthumous collection, Crossing the Water. And in some ways, I thought about the title and the poem that she made as a kind of form, this title plus persona. And it was like the doorway I needed into just making something. So The Beekeeper's Husband seems also key because in the chapbook, it's really the only poem that's from a male speaker. And I wanted that departure to be clear to the reader. So in a book that's really concerned a lot with women, this poem stands out in a way.
Yeah. Tell us more about the attraction and the challenges of writing from the male perspective.
I don't think that there were many challenges, but there was a lot that drew me and attracted me to that. So I wanted to investigate a kind of mundane cruelty that can creep into relationships. And I wanted to do that from the perspective of someone who's creating the harm as opposed to what we might call the victim of that. And in some ways, again, this is like in the context of the chapbook because there's a lot of concern around violence against women in Blood of the Air.
Right.
And I wanted to just add some texture to the effort of that description, both by looking at a different perspective, but also looking at different kinds of violences. So, what the beekeeper's husband is doing in his speech is it's very subdued, maybe, but I still think it's harmful. He's they're in bed, they've experienced intimacy together, and then he's saying something that he actually knows isn't true and wounding the beekeeper purposefully. So I wanted to explore both the different perspective, not just the kind of victim of violence, but also this other piece around different kinds of violences. And that's mainly the attraction to writing the poem.
Yeah, I can see that, particularly in the scope of that whole collection. And I hadn't thought about how that this is the one departure in terms of voice, but maybe that's what attracts readers to it.
Mm.
In a statement at the National Endowment for the Arts website, you credit Mentorship, among other influences, to the writings of other poets living and dead, and that's a phrase that caught my attention. As you've mentioned already, Sylvia Plath is one who is kind of in the background of this poem. And I wonder if there are any other particular poets whose influence you might tease out of the poem, or if there's more about Plath that you might want to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think what maybe I would just add is this idea of thinking about this as a form, I think is interesting. And probably someone could do some research around like where these kinds of poems pop up. But I read the collected Anne Sexton during the lockdown and pandemic. And I know there was a poem or two in this kind of form in that like in her body of work. And there's also this poem by Bridget Pekin Kelly that's doing a similar thing. And I wonder if I mean, I guess it just speaks to the allure of persona that isn't so dramatic, but that is a little bit more subdued.
Yeah, I think there is that subtlety of persona in the poem. It's not as dramatic as what Robert Browning might do, in My Last Duchess or something like that, where the speaker literally condemns himself through what he says. And I like that layering that you've done as a way of kind of getting at the persona without necessarily raising an indictment of the speaker, but saying there are blind spots in all of us.
Right. Yeah. And or someone like Frank Bedard or these and that, maybe one day I'll write a poem that really gets into this other extreme. But I think it's helpful just as a human to kind of understand where someone else is coming from through the process of actually embodying their voice.
Right. Well, it's the walk a mile in my shoes before you criticize me mentality that I think is so useful, particularly for poets, but for every person as we think about our role as a poet, but also as a citizen of whatever community we're a part of. And I like the fact that you brought up persona. In an interview with Crosstown Arts, you said that you enjoy utilizing the thin mask of persona. And we've already looked at that a little bit. And I recognize that your voice and the beekeeper's husband's voice are not the same, but that thin mask suggests that maybe there are some overlaps. And I wonder if you might give us some insight or some revelation about where you and the beekeeper's husband might be on the same page.
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned kind of the big, like zooming out to society, and I, I, I feel like if I'm not able to see myself or my own capacity for cruelty or dishonesty or an unwillingness to be vulnerable, then I can't write this poem. And that's also what attracted me to writing it. And I think it's easy to see oneself or portray oneself as always the person who is, right and good and being harmed or wounded and not like having that capacity to do the same thing. But I don't believe in a world of villains or monsters or saints. I think that's actually really destructive. That ideology is really destructive. So as much as I hope that I act out of love and in spite of my fear or instead of my fear, I know that I'm also like capable of hurting other people. And I want to be able to recognize that. And as a writer, I can do that through the process of writing in this persona, this like taking on this mask. Um, it feels like a recognition of not only my humanity, but a shared humanity. And that can give way to understanding at the least, and perhaps compassion if we're lucky.
Yeah, I think that's entirely true. I want to look at the poem in detail just for a second. At
Mm-hmm.
one place, just past the middle of the poem, there's a turning point in our understanding of the relationship between this couple. For the first two-thirds or so, there is what sounds like a loving relationship, at least from his perspective. And then he kisses her hand at what sounds like a flashback to their introduction. It's lines 21 and 22. And he announces, "This is the gesture that began our troubles." Can you elaborate on the misunderstanding of that moment, or how it affects the relationship?
Yeah, I am supremely fascinated by the idea of like all that will be exposed and revealed in the course of a relationship, all that kind of unfurls is present at the beginning of it, and that could be a friendship or that could be, in this case, a marriage. So the fact that the husband actually can see clearly where he believes the trouble began, which is the moment that he kisses her hand. It's a moment of interpretation and it's a moment of misinterpretation. And the wife, the beekeeper, locates it in another place. And it reminds me of how, even in love, we are deeply unknowable. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. We are knowable and we are perpetually strangers to one another. So even if you've been married to someone for 50 years, there's some unknowability.
Mhm.
And I think that reading of the gesture as sweet and him knowing that his impulse was craving salt is a symbol of that. And I just like the idea of like looking at a moment or a gesture that can, I guess, yeah, be emblematic of that kind of conflict and divergence. And that in some ways you can see the divergence from the beginning.
And I think all of us crave the concreteness of something in our own relationships that we can look back to and say, "Oh, that's when it changed." But for so many of us, I think we're always looking for it, and we're second guessing, and we're saying, "Well, maybe this, maybe that."
Yeah.
And so having that emblem, that is the moment, that sense of surety, uh, I think gives a kind of strength to the speaker of the poem that many of the readers will aspire to.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, it also is that point of, what we do as human beings is look back and then create a logic. And I mean, in some ways, that's a comforting habit. um, but yeah, there's, I don't know, it's something that I think I'm really fascinated with. Just, I mean, you live long enough and there are relationships, again, like any kinds of relationships that are just not going to last for your life. And to kind of examine them and see, when do I see the end in the beginning or in the middle is an interesting question.
Yeah. Yeah, let's go down to the end of the poem. The poem ends with those two contrary images of the dream world and the waking world. And I wonder if you could tell us a little more about those contradictory visions of the world.
Sure. So let me reread those last lines. That night, I slept soundly, sprawled on top of the sheets. I dreamt I was wingless and beautiful, treading water in a crystal blue sea. When I woke the next morning, ashen twigs and brittle leaves lay scattered on your pillow. So the husband, and I don't know if this is like apparent. You can tell me, Stan,
Yeah.
but he's acting dishonestly and intending to harm from my point of view, not from the point of view of the persona, but from my point of view as a reader or a listener. And I think it's interesting because people often say, like, I don't know how that person sleeps well. But I think people who harm other people sleep fine. I think they sleep fine. And while he's sleeping, we don't really know what's going on with the beekeeper or the wife. But we have this last image, which is either an image of transformation or a message to the husband. And I really liked that she has the last word, even though it's a poem that's in his voice.
Yes, and I think that clear contrast between the way he dreams and the way he sees in the morning uh, really sets this poem off. And I hadn't thought of that last image of the twigs on the pillow as being her voice, but in essence, it is that's what she is reduced to through his treatment of her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Is there anything else you would like to add to help us appreciate this poem?
Well, I mean, in some ways, to me, it's a psychological investigation. And I think one of the hearts of the poem is that the husband accuses the beekeeper of invulnerability, but he's the one who creates the distance between them in that moment in the bed. So he is actually being invulnerable and accusing her of being invulnerable. And that's what's dishonest about his speech.
Yeah.
So even though she's the one who turns her naked back, he really already has turned his back. And I think that that's that kind of subterranean or psychological that, upon reading and rereading, I feel like that's part of the joys of making poems and reading them is like getting getting this kind of reflection of what I've experienced as real, which is what's under the words.
Right. Yes. Yeah, and I think as readers, that's what enriches a poem, or that's what gives life to a poem, is being able to understand that the words are the surface of the poem, but not necessarily the depth of the poem. As you were talking, I was thinking of Hamlet when he does the mousetrap play, and he says of his mother, "Methinks she doth protest too much." Too often we project our own problems into the behavior of others, and I hear you saying that about the beekeeper's husband projecting his own faults into the wife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Alma's recent poems have appeared in the Best American Poetry, Prairie Schooner, the Yale Review, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA in creative writing from New York University. For Pier-Glass Poetry, I'm Stan Galloway, wishing you a poetic day.